There is a profound misunderstanding about silence, a common belief that it signifies surrender. It is often mistaken for acceptance, for the quiet compliance of a spirit that has been broken. But this is a dangerous assumption. For sometimes, silence is not an absence of noise, but a presence of thought. It is the careful, patient gathering of storm clouds on a distant horizon, the slow, meticulous sharpening of a blade in the dark. In the grand, opulent theater of family life, the quietest person in the room is not the weakest. They are the one who is listening, watching, and waiting for the precise moment when their silence will finally speak, not with a whisper, but with the force of a thunderclap. In the mahogany-walled office of Mr. Atherton, the Vance family's long-serving lawyer, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the thin veneer of fresh grief. Eleanor Vance, a matriarch carved from ice and ambition, sat perfectly upright, her impatience a subtle, rhythmic tapping of a single manicured nail against her leather handbag. Beside her, her daughter Chloe shifted restlessly, her designer morning dress failing to conceal a spirit of pure entitlement. And then there was Liam, the golden son, the grieving heir apparent, his handsome face set in a somber mask that couldn't quite hide the flicker of anticipation in his eyes. He was the husband of Alara, and Alara was there too, seated slightly apart from them, a ghost in a simple black dress. For 10 years, she had been an afterthought in this family, her presence acknowledged only when a task needed doing. Today was no different. They barely looked at her. Mr. Atherton cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at the last will and testament of Richard Vance, the patriarch whose death had set this scene in motion. "And now," the lawyer began, his voice dry, "we come to the disposition of Mr. Vance's primary assets." A collective, almost imperceptible lean-in came from Eleanor, Liam, and Chloe. This was the moment they had been waiting for. "To my beloved daughter-in-law, Mr." Atherton read, each word landing like a hammer blow, "Alara Vance. I bequeath the entirety of my controlling shares in Vance Enterprises, the deed to the Vance family estate, and sole signatory power over the Vance Family Trust, effective immediately." The silence that followed was not quiet. It was a deafening, violent void. It was broken by Eleanor's sharp, horrified gasp, a sound like shattering glass. Chloe's face twisted from smug disdain to slack-jawed disbelief, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Liam's head snapped towards his wife, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into a dawning primal fear. But Alara did not move. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she didn't even blink. In that moment, she simply felt the crushing weight of a decade of humiliation, of servitude, of silent suffering begin to shift. It was a tectonic recalibration of power, and she could feel it deep in her bones. The weight was not lifting, it was transmuting, changing from a burden into a shield, and then into a sword. The storm had finally made landfall. Before the steel entered her spine and ice formed in her veins, Alara was a woman built of warmth and logic. Her world, before the Vances, was a meritocracy of numbers and predictable outcomes. As a senior financial analyst at a competitive firm in New York City, she spoke the fluent, elegant language of stock markets and leveraged buyouts. She understood value, risk, and return on investment. Her own background was modest, a product of loving, middle-class parents who had taught her that success was something you built with your own two hands and the power of your mind. Her life was a well-executed plan, a portfolio of smart decisions, and she was proud of the woman she was becoming. Love, she had always assumed, would be a partnership, another sound investment. Then she met Liam Vance. He was like a character from a novel she'd never have thought to read. They met at a charity art auction, an event Alara attended for networking purposes. Liam was there because it was his family's natural habitat. He moved with an easy, unhurried grace that spoke of generations of unearned confidence. His smile, a disarming weapon he wielded with expert precision. He wasn't just handsome, he was charming in a way that seemed to bypass all of Alara's logical defenses. He listened to her opinions on market trends with a focused intensity that made her feel like the most interesting person in the room. He spoke of his own life with a self-deprecating humor that masked the staggering scale of his privilege. For the first time, Alara's carefully calculated world was disrupted by the chaotic, intoxicating variable of pure emotion. She fell in love with the beautiful, impossible idea of him, believing that the strength of their connection could bridge the chasm between their two worlds. Their courtship was a whirlwind of experiences designed to dazzle. Dinners at restaurants with unlisted numbers, weekends on yachts that sliced through the Atlantic, introductions to people whose names were whispered in financial journals. Alara, ever the analyst, saw the disparity in their lives, but filed it under challenges to overcome. The first time Liam took her to the Vance family estate in Connecticut, she finally understood. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a museum to its own importance, a stone and marble declaration of dominance. And its curator was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor's welcome was a masterpiece of polite hostility. Her handshake was brief and cold, a transaction rather than a greeting. She appraised Alara from head to toe, her gaze lingering for a moment too long on the brand of Alara's shoes. "So, you're the analyst," Eleanor had said, the words themselves neutral, but the tone coating them in a fine layer of condescension. "How fascinating." She asked about Alara's family, her questions about their professions and neighborhood designed not to learn, but to classify. Chloe, Liam's younger sister, offered a dismissive giggle and an eye roll, making it clear she found the entire introduction a bore. Only Richard Vance, the patriarch, was different. He was a man of few words, observing the interaction from his armchair by the fireplace. He watched Alara, not with the dismissive air of his wife or the childish contempt of his daughter, but with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He simply nodded at her, a gesture that was impossible to read. Liam, oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, squeezed her hand and whispered, "They'll love you. Just give them time." They married 6 months later, in a ceremony that felt more like a state function than a wedding. It was an Eleanor Vance production from start to finish. After a blissful honeymoon, carefully insulated from the world, the cracks began to appear. It started with Alara's career. One evening, Eleanor summoned her for a talk in the grand sitting room, the kind of conversation that was framed as advice but was, in reality, a command. "Alara, darling," she began, pouring tea with practiced elegance. "A woman's most important merger is her marriage. Vance Enterprises certainly doesn't need another analyst, but Liam needs a wife who can truly support his future. He needs a hostess, a partner in his social obligations. Your little job, it's admirable, of course, but it's a distraction, don't you think?" Alara was stunned. Her job wasn't little. It was her identity, the foundation of her self-worth. She looked to Liam for support, but he simply smiled his placating smile. "She has a point, Elle," he said later that night, as if discussing the weather. "Think of the freedom you'll have. We could travel more. You wouldn't have to deal with the stress. Isn't this what we want? A real life, together, not just stolen moments between meetings." He framed her surrender as their victory. The pressure was immense, a velvet glove squeezing the life out of her ambition. Reluctantly, with a grief she couldn't fully articulate, she tendered her resignation. She told herself it was a sacrifice for love. It was, in fact, her first great surrender. Once she was untethered from her own world, the Vance family's subtle remolding of her began in earnest. The criticisms were never direct attacks, always disguised as helpful suggestions. "That dress is lovely, dear, but perhaps a bit simple for a Vance," Eleanor would say, before having a collection of more appropriate clothes delivered to her closet. Chloe would comment on Alara's way of speaking. "Oh, that's such a quaint expression. Where did you pick that up?" Her recipes were altered, her decorative tastes were overridden, her opinions on current events were politely ignored at the dinner table. She was being systematically erased and redrawn as a blank, pleasing accessory to the Vance family portrait. Each time a barb stung, each time she felt the sting of their casual cruelty, she would turn to Liam, and his response was always the same. He would wrap his arms around her, kiss her forehead, and utter the words that would become the anthem of her isolation. "Don't be so sensitive. That's just how they are. They don't mean anything by it. He was her translator of insults, her normalizer of disrespect. He taught her to doubt her own feelings, to believe that the problem wasn't their behavior, but her reaction to it. The death of a dream is a quiet affair, marked not by a single catastrophic event, but by 1,000 small concessions. In these early days of her marriage, Alara made concessions she didn't even realize she was making. And it was in these daily surrenders, these moments of swallowing her pride and biting her tongue, that the maid was made, and the woman she had been was slowly, painstakingly put to sleep, waiting, dormant, for a time when she would be needed again. The Vance family annual charity gala was the crown jewel of their social calendar, an event less about charity and more about the public performance of power. It was a night where alliances were forged over champagne, where fortunes were discussed in hushed tones, and where the Vance family name was polished to a brilliant shine for all of their gilded world to see. For years, it had been Eleanor's masterpiece. But this year, in a move that Alara initially mistook for an olive branch, Eleanor had delegated the planning of the entire event to her. "It's time you took on a more significant role, dear," she had said, her smile as thin as a razor's edge. "Let's see what you're capable of." Alara knew it wasn't an opportunity. It was a test. It was a meticulously designed stage upon which she was destined to fail. And so, she resolved not to. For 3 months, she poured every ounce of the intelligence and discipline from her former career into the gala. She was no longer analyzing stock portfolios. She was analyzing floral arrangements, catering contracts, and the delicate, treacherous ecosystem of the seating chart. She negotiated with vendors with a shrewdness that surprised them, cutting costs without sacrificing quality. She designed a theme that was elegant and modern, a subtle departure from Eleanor's more baroque tastes. She cross-referenced every allergy, confirmed every RSVP, and triple-checked every delivery schedule. This gala became her silent rebellion, her chance to prove, in a language of competence they couldn't ignore, that she was more than the simple girl they thought she was. She was determined to make the evening flawless, and for a while, it was. The night of the gala arrived, and the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was transformed into her vision. A sea of black ties and glittering diamonds moved through the space, the air humming with the sound of a string quartet and expensive perfume. Alara, in a deep sapphire gown she had chosen herself, felt a flicker of pride. She saw Liam laughing with a senator, Chloe holding court with a circle of young socialites, and even Eleanor, standing near the entrance, had a look of begrudging approval on her face. For a fleeting moment, Alara allowed herself to hope. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this was the night she would finally earn a sliver of their respect. The incident, when it came, was so small, so insignificant, that it was almost comical. It centered on the wine being served at the head table where the governor of New York was seated. The menu, approved by Eleanor herself, had specified a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a legendary vintage. The caterer, due to a supplier error entirely beyond Alara's control, had sourced the 1983 vintage instead. It was still an exquisite, outrageously expensive wine, a detail 99% of the guests would never notice. But Eleanor Vance was in the 1%. She discovered the discrepancy during the main course. Alara saw it happen from across the room. Eleanor's sommelier-like swirl of the glass, the delicate sniff, the thoughtful sip, and then the subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. She didn't make a scene. She did something far worse. With the governor and his wife looking on, she beckoned Alara to the table with a single imperious flick of her fingers. As Alara approached, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach, Eleanor spoke, her voice not a shout, but a low, perfectly projected whisper designed to be heard by everyone at the table and no one else. "Alara," she began, a cold smile playing on her lips, "I entrusted you with a single, critical responsibility. The comfort of our most esteemed guests." She gestured with her glass. "This is the 83. I specified the 82. Is it truly so difficult to read a label? Or perhaps," she paused, "letting the cruelty land, wines of this caliber are simply beyond your usual frame of reference." The humiliation was instant and absolute. It was an attack on her competence, her class, her very presence at that table. The governor offered a polite, uncomfortable cough. His wife suddenly became fascinated by her water glass. The conversation died, replaced by an awkward silence that felt like a physical blow. Alara stood there, frozen, the blood draining from her face. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, all seeing her as Eleanor intended, an incompetent, lower-class imposter who had spoiled the party. She managed a choked, "I'll see to it immediately," before turning and walking away, her composure shattering with every step. She found refuge on a small, deserted balcony overlooking Central Park, the cool night air, a welcome shock to her burning cheeks. She leaned against the cold stone, taking deep, shuddering breaths, waiting for Liam to follow her. She needed him. She needed him to storm out, to wrap his arms around her and tell her that his mother was a cruel, vindictive woman. She needed him to be her husband. When he finally appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the ballroom's golden light, his face was not filled with sympathy. It was tight with annoyance. "Alara, what are you doing out here?" he hissed, keeping his voice low. "You're causing a scene." The words were so far from what she needed to hear that she could barely process them. "A scene? Liam, did you hear what your mother said to me in there? In front of all those people?" He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "I'm sure she was just stressed. You know how she gets about this event." He stepped closer, not to comfort her, but to block her from the view of the party. "Look, can you please not make this a bigger deal than it is? Just go back inside, find my mother, and apologize. Just smooth it over. For me." It wasn't his words that finally broke her. It was the complete and utter absence of love behind them. In that moment, the handsome, charming man she had married vanished, replaced by a stranger. This was not her partner. This was a brand manager, and she was a public relations crisis that needed to be contained. His priority was not her pain, but the family's image. She was not on his team. She was a variable that was messing up his equation. The promise he had made at the altar, to love and to cherish, to honor and to protect, evaporated into the cold night air. It wasn't just broken, it was revealed to have been an illusion all along. She didn't cry. The wound was too deep, too clean for tears. Something inside her went very still and very cold. She straightened up from the railing, the sapphire of her dress looking almost black in the dim light. She looked at her husband, truly looked at him, and saw him for what he was. A weak, hollow man, a gilded puppet on his mother's strings. "You're right," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "I should go back inside." Without another word, she walked past him, back into the glittering ballroom. The hopeful girl who had walked out onto that balcony did not return. A different woman did. A woman who now understood, with perfect, chilling clarity, that she was utterly and completely alone. The night of the charity gala marked a silent, fundamental shift in the architecture of Alara's life. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic argument. The war was simply over, and she had lost. When they had returned to the Vance estate in the suffocating silence of the limousine, Liam had gone to one wing of the house and she to another. The next morning, the new terms of her existence were unspoken, but perfectly clear. The family's thin pretense of accepting her as a member had been discarded like last night's decorations. She was no longer a daughter-in-law. She was staff. Her life, once a dynamic landscape of ambition and intellectual challenge, shrank to the predictable, suffocating rhythm of the Vance household. Her days were no longer her own. They were a long list of tasks dictated by the whims of Eleanor and Chloe. She became the unpaid, invisible engine that kept the grand estate running. Mornings began before sunrise, liaising with the cook over the day's menus, ensuring they aligned with Eleanor's ever-changing dietary restrictions and social calendar. Then, she would manage the rest of the domestic staff, becoming the unwilling buffer between a disgruntled gardener and Eleanor's wrath over a slightly wilted rosebush, or mediating a dispute between housekeepers. She was held responsible for every imperfection, from a fingerprint on a silver platter to a mistimed delivery, yet her presence was never acknowledged when things ran smoothly. Her role as a social secretary, which had begun with the ill-fated gala, became her primary function, but she was never the hostess. She was the architect who was banished from the building upon its completion. For Eleanor's frequent, lavish dinner parties, Alara did everything. She curated the guest lists, drafted the invitations, coordinated with chefs on multi-course tasting menus, and agonized over seating charts that were as politically complex as a UN summit. She would spend weeks ensuring every detail was perfect, only to be dismissed to the kitchens or her room as the first guests arrived. She would hear the distant echo of laughter and clinking glasses from parties she had orchestrated, but was not welcome at, a ghost in her own home. Chloe, emboldened by her mother's open disdain for Alara, began to treat her as a personal assistant. Her demands were petty and constant, designed to reinforce Alara's subordinate status. "Alara, my cashmere sweater needs to go to the dry cleaner, the special one on Madison Avenue, and I need it back by tomorrow," she would command, without a please or thank you. Alara was tasked with booking Chloe's spa appointments, walking her yapping teacup poodle, and chasing down online orders that Chloe was too lazy to track herself. Each request was an assertion of power, a small reminder that Alara's time and energy had no value of their own. The most painful part was the systematic intellectual erasure. The sharp, analytical mind that had once been her greatest asset was now treated as a liability. At the dinner table, if a guest discussed business or the economy, Alara would feel the ghost of her old self stir, an opinion forming on her lips. One evening, a Vance Enterprises board member was lamenting a volatile tech stock. Out of pure instinct, Alara murmured, "It's a classic pump and dump. Their Q3 earnings report was padded with foreign receivables that don't exist." The table fell silent. Eleanor turned to her, a smile of pure poison on her face. "How sweet that you try to keep up, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But let's leave the complex topics to the people who understand them, shall we?" Liam said nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate, his silence a resounding endorsement of his mother's cruelty. After that, Alara learned to say nothing at all. She ate in silence, listened in silence, and disappeared from conversations as soon as they began. She perfected the art of being invisible. Her marriage, the very foundation of this life, was now a hollow formality. Liam was no longer her partner, he was simply the man who slept down the hall. He saw her servitude as the natural order of things. He appreciated the flawlessly run home, the perfectly organized social life, the way she managed his mother and sister's difficult personalities, but he never saw the cost to her. He saw the result of her labor, but never the laborer herself. Their interactions were transactional, revolving around schedules and household needs. The man she had loved was gone, and in his place was a complacent stranger who had traded his wife for a life of ease. For years, this was her reality, a gilded cage where the bars were made of casual cruelty and silent contempt. She was withering, the vibrant woman she had once been fading into a pale, quiet automaton. And then came a moment, a single, unexpected interaction that planted a seed in the barren soil of her existence. It happened late one night. Alara was in the Grand Library, a room she was only ever in to dust or organize. Eleanor had given her the mind-numbingly tedious task of cataloging Richard's vast collection of first-edition economics books. It felt like a particularly cruel joke, forcing her to handle the very symbols of the world she had been forced to abandon. She was on a rolling ladder, carefully logging a rare copy of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, when Richard Vance entered the room. He rarely came in this late. She expected him to ignore her, as usual. Instead, he walked over to his large oak desk and picked up a thick financial prospectus. He was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up at her on the ladder. "Come down," he said. His voice was not unkind, just direct. She did as she was told, her heart beating a little faster. He handed her the document. "Vandelay Industries," he said, his eyes fixed on her, searching. "They are proposing a hostile takeover of a smaller competitor. My board sees it as an aggressive, profitable move. I have my doubts." He tapped a page. "Look at this. Tell me what you see." Hesitantly, Alara took the prospectus. The feel of the heavy paper, the familiar columns of numbers. It was like a phantom limb starting to tingle. Her old mind, dormant for so long, flickered to life. She scanned the pages, her eyes flying over the balance sheets, the cash flow statements, the footnotes. The others saw her as a maid. But Richard, in this moment, was seeing her as an analyst. After a few minutes of intense silence, she pointed to a single line item. "Here," she said, her voice a bit rusty. "Their accounts receivable. It's inflated by over 30%. They're factoring in projected international sales from a market that is currently politically unstable. It's not real money, it's hope. They're trying to over-leverage to fund the acquisition, making themselves look bigger than they are. If the deal goes through and that market collapses, they'll be bankrupt within a year." She finished, her breath held, expecting to be dismissed. Richard took the document back from her. He stared at it, then he looked at her, and for the first time, she felt truly seen. He didn't smile. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You see the skeleton beneath the skin," he said, his voice quiet. "Everyone else is admiring the clothes." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You have a sharp mind, Alara. Don't ever let it rust." He turned and left the library without another word. The encounter lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed everything for Alara. It didn't change her daily chores or the contempt she faced from his wife and children, but it changed her internal reality. It was a confirmation that the woman she used to be was not dead, just sleeping. Someone knew she was in there. Richard's respect was a single drop of water in an endless desert, but it was enough. From that day forward, she was no longer just a servant. She was an observer, a silent analyst in the heart of the Vance empire. The maid was now keeping records. In the years that followed Richard Vance's quiet acknowledgement in the library, the landscape of Alara's marriage became a frozen, silent tundra. The opposite of love, she learned, is not hatred. Hatred is a fire, a passionate, consuming thing. The opposite of love is indifference, and the Vance estate was saturated with it. Liam's indifference was a tangible presence, a constant, low-grade chill in every room they shared. He and Alara were no longer husband and wife. They were cohabitants, two ghosts gliding past each other in the opulent hallways, their conversations reduced to the bare, sterile logistics of their shared existence. "Eleanor wants to host the senator's fundraiser on the 5th. The caterer has confirmed. Chloe needs to be picked up from the airport on Friday." There were no questions about her day, no shared jokes, no casual touches. He looked at her, but he no longer saw her. She was simply part of the household machinery, and as long as the machine ran smoothly, he had no reason to inspect the gears. But as he receded from their marriage, he began to occupy a new, vibrant life elsewhere. It began with the classic signs, the cliched symptoms of a straying husband, the late nights at the office that became more and more frequent, the last-minute business trips over weekends that left no itinerary. He started guarding his phone with a new, quiet vigilance, placing it screen down on tables, a habit he had never had before. A faint, unfamiliar scent of jasmine and sandalwood would sometimes cling to his suits, a fragrance far too exotic for Eleanor or Chloe. There were receipts she would find in his pockets while doing his laundry for dinners for two at intimate restaurants she had never been to, for jewelry from boutiques he had never mentioned. The old Alara, the heartbroken wife, might have ignored these signs, might have buried them under a mountain of denial. But the new Alara, the analyst Richard Vance had reawakened, could not. She began to collect these observations, not as a wife gathering evidence of betrayal, but as a strategist mapping an enemy's movements. Each clue was a data point in a grim new analysis. She remained silent, her face a mask of placid neutrality. She continued her duties, managing the house, enduring the contempt of her in-laws, and serving a husband who was living a lie. Her silence was not weakness, it was the quiet hum of a mind at work, calculating, processing, and waiting for undeniable proof. The proof arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. Liam had come home late, mumbling something about a difficult merger negotiation before disappearing for a long, hot shower. Alara was in their bedroom, turning down the sheets, an act of domesticity that felt like a bitter parody. His phone, left carelessly on the bedside table, buzzed. It lit up, and a message preview flashed across the screen. Her heart stopped. It was a simple, brutal string of words, but it held the power to detonate her entire world. "Last night was incredible," it read. "Mother was so happy to see us together at the club. She says you've never looked happier. I can't wait until this is all over and we can be official. Love, Isabella." Alara stared at the screen, the name Isabella burning into her retinas. The room felt suddenly airless, the sound of the rain outside fading to a dull roar in her ears. For a long, frozen moment, she did nothing. Then, with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she picked up the phone. Her fingers, moving with a cold, robotic precision, unlocked it. Liam, in his arrogance, had never bothered to change the simple passcode. The message thread was a novel of their affair, a detailed account of her husband's secret life, but it was the name and the mention of mother that twisted the knife. Isabella Croft, of course, the daughter of a rival real estate tycoon, a woman of impeccable breeding and ruthless social ambition. She was the woman Eleanor had been parading in front of Liam for years, the perfect match Alara could never be. Ilara's mind, a whirlwind of pain and fury, began to connect the dots with terrifying speed. This wasn't a random, sordid affair. This was a coup. A carefully orchestrated plan, sanctioned and encouraged by his mother, to finally replace the inadequate middle-class girl with a more suitable bride. All the years of humiliation, the insults, the servitude, it wasn't just casual cruelty. It was a systematic campaign to break her down, to make her leave, and when that hadn't worked, they had simply decided to go around her. She wasn't just being cheated on, she was being strategically eliminated. A wave of white-hot rage washed over her, so intense it almost made her nauseous. She wanted to storm into the bathroom and smash the phone against the marble walls. She wanted to scream, to confront him, to see the shock and fear on his handsome, lying face. But then, just as quickly as it came, the rage subsided, replaced by a profound and chilling clarity. She played the scene out in her head, her tearful accusation, his indignant denial, his accusations that she had snooped through his phone. Then would come the gaslighting, the masterful twisting of reality that he and his mother were so skilled at. He would tell her she was crazy, hysterical, that Isabella was just a friend. His mother would be his primary witness, confirming their innocent dinner, her face a mask of disappointed sympathy for her poor, paranoid daughter-in-law. By the end of the night, Alara would be the villain. She had no money, no power, no allies in this house. Confronting him now would be emotional suicide. They would close ranks, and she would be cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back, her reputation in tatters. She realized, in that moment, that the love she had once felt for Liam was well and truly dead. You cannot love a man who is actively plotting your destruction. And with the death of that love, the pain began to transform. It was no longer the raw, desperate agony of a broken heart. It was something colder, harder, and far more dangerous. It was the birth of resolve. With methodical calm, she took her own phone and photographed the damning messages. She forwarded the images to a secure, private email account she had created months ago for just such a contingency. She logged every detail, every date, every location mentioned. She was no longer a wife. She was a prosecutor building a case. She then deleted the photo from her phone and placed Liam's phone back on the nightstand, exactly as it had been. When he emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a fluffy white towel, steam billowing around him, he saw his wife standing by the bed. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice casual, oblivious. Alara turned to him and managed a small, empty smile. "Everything is fine," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I was just turning down the bed for you." He saw nothing in her eyes. No pain, no anger, no heartbreak. He saw only the placid, obedient wife he had grown accustomed to. He did not see the woman who had just declared a silent, secret war. The pain had not vanished. It had simply changed its state, like water freezing into a shard of ice. It became hard, sharp, and patient. She had been a wife, then a maid. Now, she was something else entirely. She was a keeper of secrets, waiting for a winter that was sure to come. Power in the Vance family was a solid thing, a mountain named Richard. He was the center of their gravity, the source of their wealth, the silent, formidable force around which they all orbited. His presence was so immense, so constant, that they had forgotten a mountain could ever fall. And then, on an utterly ordinary Thursday afternoon, while reading the Wall Street Journal in his study, Richard Vance's heart, a mechanism that had powered an empire, simply stopped. The mountain crumbled into dust. The news of his death descended upon the estate, not with the quiet sorrow of loss, but with the chaotic energy of a power vacuum. The grief of his family was immediate, loud, and impeccably performed. Eleanor, upon hearing the news, did not collapse in tears. She placed a perfectly manicured hand to her chest, her face a mask of tragic shock, but her eyes were sharp, her mind already calculating the immense, terrifying logistics of her new position as the powerful widow. Her sorrow was for the loss of her role as the wife of the king, not for the king himself. Liam rushed to her side, playing the part of the devoted, grieving son. He held his mother, his shoulders shaking with practiced sobs. But later that evening, Alara saw him in the hallway on the phone with the company's CFO, his voice not choked with grief, but crisp, authoritative, and impatient. He was a man stepping into a pair of shoes he believed were finally his to fill. Chloe's morning was the most theatrical of all, a torrent of dramatic social media posts and tearful phone calls to her friends. Her sadness seeming to focus less on her father's absence and more on the inconvenience to her social schedule. Amid this symphony of performative mourning, Alara was an island of quiet, genuine grief. She retreated to the library, the one room in the house that held a positive memory for her. She ran her hand over the leather-bound economics books she had been cataloging, her fingers tracing the spine of the book Richard had shown her. She did not weep for a lost father-in-law. She wept for the loss of the only person in her 14 years with the Vances who had ever looked at her and seen a mind, not a maid. He had been her only witness, the sole keeper of the secret that she was still a person of value. His quiet respect had been a tiny, flickering candle in the vast darkness of her life, and now it had been extinguished. She was truly, completely alone again. The days leading up to the funeral were a macabre social marathon. The Vance estate became a revolving door for the East Coast's elite, a stage for the public display of influence and condolence. And in this grand theater of grief, Ilara's role as a servant was solidified and amplified. While Eleanor, Liam, and Chloe accepted sympathies in the grand drawing room, their faces etched with practiced sorrow, Alara was in the background, a blur of constant, silent motion. She was the one who conferred with the funeral director about the morbid practicalities of casket selection and floral arrangements. She was the one who stood by the kitchen doors, ensuring the caterers kept the silver platters of food for the wake constantly replenished. She was the one who collected the coats of senators and CEOs, who offered tissues to weeping business partners, who managed the overwhelming flood of condolence cards and flower deliveries. Her servitude was never more apparent than when Eleanor, looking pale and tragically beautiful in black silk, would summon her in front of important guests. "Ilara, darling," she would say, her voice a fragile whisper that carried across the room. "The Blantons are here, and there are no more miniature quiches. Do be a dear and see to it. My heart simply can't take any more stress today." The message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. Ilara was not family. She was the help, the functional object that managed the unpleasant details so the real mourners could grieve in peace. Liam would walk past her, his eyes distant, occasionally handing her a list of calls to return on his behalf. They used their grief as both a shield and a weapon, a justification for their complete and utter reliance on her invisible labor. In the quiet moments, in the hallways and forgotten corners of the house, Alara, the silent observer, overheard the whispers of the future. The family, certain of the line of succession, did not even wait for Richard to be buried before they began carving up his kingdom. One night, she was passing Richard's study when she heard their voices from inside the slightly ajar door. They were supposed to be looking for his old military medals for the funeral display. Instead, they were planning their new reign. Father was brilliant, of course, but too conservative in his final years, Liam was saying, his voice filled with a new, confident swagger. My first move as CEO will be an aggressive expansion into the Asian tech market. It's time to take some real risks. The first thing we must do is restructure the board. Eleanor's crisp voice cut in. Henderson and Albright must go. They were loyal to your father, not to us. I have a list of more suitable replacements. And the penthouse on Fifth Avenue? Chloe's voice whined. Daddy was so old-fashioned about me living there alone. Can I have it now, Liam? Please? Ilara stood motionless in the hall, a ghost listening to the heirs divide their spoils. They spoke as if the will was a mere formality, a rubber stamp on a future that was already decided. Her name was never mentioned. Her existence was not even a footnote in their grand plans. She was a piece of the household furniture, and they had no idea that the furniture could hear and think and remember. The morning of the will reading dawned gray and quiet. The funeral was over. The last of the mourning guests had departed. A heavy, expectant silence settled over the vast estate. This was the silence before the storm. Ilara dressed with a slow, deliberate care she had not felt in years. She chose a simple, elegant, dark gray dress, a stark contrast to the functional black uniform she had worn for the past week. She was not dressing as a servant today. She did not know what the will contained, but a strange, unbidden sense of finality washed over her. Richard had seen her. He had spoken to her. He had acknowledged her mind. A man that perceptive, that precise, did not act without reason. As she walked down the grand staircase to join the family for the drive to the lawyer's office, they barely glanced at her, their minds already on the riches that awaited them. They saw a maid, a shadow, a non-entity. They had no idea they were walking into the room with the woman who held their entire world in her hands. The office of Mr. Atherton felt like a vacuum, a place where sound and time behaved differently. A tall grandfather clock in the corner ticked with an agonizingly slow, deliberate rhythm, each second marking a step closer to a verdict. The air, thick with the scent of leather bindings and floor polish, was heavy with unspoken greed. Eleanor, Liam, and Chloe sat on one side of the vast mahogany desk, a united front of entitled mourners. Ilara sat on the other, separate, a silent counterpoint to their restless energy. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching a play about her own life from a great distance. Mr. Atherton, a man who seemed to be made of the same dry paper as the documents before him, began to read. His voice was a monotone drone, listing the will's preliminary bequests with methodical slowness. A sum of money to Richard's estranged sister, a donation to his alma mater, his collection of antique maps to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. With each minor bequest, the impatience of the Vance family grew more palpable. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Chloe sighed dramatically. Liam shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the final, thickest pages of the document. They were enduring the opening acts, waiting for the main performance where the kingdom would be handed to its rightful heir. Finally, Mr. Atherton reached the last section. He paused, deliberately removing his spectacles to polish them with a clean white handkerchief. He took a slow sip of water. It was a gesture of a man who knew he was about to detonate a bomb and wanted to savor the final moment of peace. He put his spectacles back on and cleared his throat. Regarding the residue of my estate, he read, his voice suddenly gaining a new weight, which comprises all remaining personal and financial assets. I hereby direct the following. He looked up for a brief moment, his gaze sweeping over the family before landing, for a fraction of a second, on Ilara. All my remaining assets, including, but not limited to, my 61% controlling interest in Vance Enterprises, all associated domestic and international holdings, the deed and title to the primary Vance family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, and sole signatory power over the Vance Family Trust, I bequeath, in their entirety and without condition, to my beloved daughter-in-law, Ilara Vance. He let the words hang in the air. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow impossibly loud. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. It was as if the Vances had been turned to stone. The color drained from Liam's face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly mask of disbelief. Chloe's brow was furrowed, her expression one of utter confusion, as if her brain was refusing to process the words she had just heard. Eleanor's back, always ramrod straight, became a rigid pillar of ice. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the handles of her Hermes bag. Alara felt the room tilt. The lawyer's voice seemed to be coming from the end of a long tunnel. She felt no rush of joy, no triumphant surge of victory. Instead, a dizzying, terrifying vertigo washed over her. It was the feeling of a prisoner who, after a decade in a dark cell, is not merely freed, but handed the keys to the entire fortress, appointed its new warden. The weight of it was crushing. The power was so absolute, so immense, it was paralyzing. The silence was shattered by a sound from Eleanor, a strangled hiss of pure venom. "No," she seethed, her voice low and dangerous. "This is a farce, a forgery." She rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. She pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "She did this. She manipulated him. That creature. She must have bewitched him in his final days when he was weak. My husband was not sane when he signed this document." Chloe, taking her cue from her mother, found her voice. "This is insane. She's a nobody, a servant. She can't have everything. It's ours." Liam, however, did not erupt in anger. His was a reaction of pure, panicked desperation. He scrambled from his chair and moved towards Alara, his handsome face a mess of confusion and a slimy, manufactured sincerity. He reached for her hand. "Alara, honey, listen," he said, his voice pleading. "This is obviously a shock, a mistake, but we can handle this. This is our family, our company. We'll run it together." It's what he would have wanted. It was a pathetic, last-ditch attempt to co-opt her power, to absorb her into his world order, to convince the servant to continue serving the king, even after she had been given the crown. And in that moment, something shifted inside Alara. The vertigo receded, the shock solidified into something hard and clear. For the first time in a decade, she met her husband's gaze not as his inferior, but as his superior. She pulled her hand away from his touch. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it cut through the hysteria with the clean, cold efficiency of a surgeon's scalpel. "There is no we, Liam," she said, the words falling like chips of ice into the superheated room. "There is only me, as per your father's instructions." Before Eleanor could unleash another tirade, Mr. Atherton intervened, his calm, monotone voice slicing through the chaos. "Mrs. Vance, I can assure you, this will is perfectly valid." He tapped the document. "Richard was a meticulous man. He anticipated you might contest his decision. He had 2 separate psychiatrists from Johns Hopkins conduct full mental competency evaluations in the week he signed it. Furthermore," he added, delivering the final blow, "he had the signing witnessed by federal judge Marion Bell. He has attached notarized affidavits from all 3 parties. The document is, for all legal intents and purposes, ironclad." The words hung in the air, a death sentence to their hopes. They were trapped. Richard, the master strategist, had outmaneuvered them even from the grave. He hadn't just given Alara the power, he had built an impenetrable fortress around it. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her rage momentarily choked by the brutal finality of the law. Chloe stared blankly, tears of impotent fury welling in her eyes. Liam stood frozen, his hand still outstretched, a pathetic statue of a deposed king. The play was over. The verdict had been delivered. Alara looked at the 3 of them, at their stunned, hate-filled faces, and felt the last vestiges of the timid, broken woman they had created fall away like dust. The empire had a new ruler, and her reign was just beginning. The 20-mile drive from Mr. Atherton's office back to the Vance estate was the longest journey of their lives. No one spoke. The pristine leather and polished wood of the chauffeured Maybach, usually a symbol of their impenetrable status, now felt like a shared coffin. Eleanor stared out the window, her face a rigid mask of fury, watching the world that was no longer entirely hers rush by. Chloe wept in silent, gulping sobs, her tears staining the silk of her dress. Liam sat beside Alara, a chasm of cold air between them. his mind visibly racing as he tried to process the cataclysmic shift that had just occurred. He kept glancing at Alara, his expression a pathetic cocktail of fear, disbelief, and a dawning, desperate calculation. Alara, however, was perfectly still. She wasn't gloating. The time for emotion was over. The analytical mind that Richard Vance had respected was now fully engaged, processing variables, formulating strategies, and running scenarios. In the silence of that car ride, the grieving widow and deposed heir were stewing in the past. The new CEO was already planning the future. Her first move had been made from the lawyer's office bathroom, a quiet, 2-minute phone call that would set the tone for everything to come. As their car swept up the long gravel driveway, they saw it. A sleek, unmarked black van was parked near the grand entrance. 2 men in professional uniforms were just finishing their work on the ornate front doors. Eleanor squinted. "Who are they? What is happening?" "Security," Alara said, her voice calm and even. It was the first word spoken since they'd left the city. "I'm having the locks changed and the security system upgraded." The car came to a stop. The chauffeur, looking deeply uncomfortable, opened the door. Eleanor, Liam, and Chloe got out, expecting to walk into their home. They found their way barred by one of the technicians. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "The old key fobs and codes have all been deactivated. The new system is linked only to the primary owner's biometrics and phone." He nodded towards Alara, who was now walking towards the door. She placed her thumb on a newly installed, discreet scanner. There was a soft electronic chime, and the massive oak door clicked open. She walked inside, then turned to face the 3 stunned figures on the steps. For a decade, she had been the one waiting to be granted entry. Now, they stood on the outside, looking in. The symbolism was brutal and perfect. "You may come in," she said, her tone neither welcoming nor hostile. It was simply a statement of fact. They entered the grand foyer, not as masters of the house, but as trespassers on her mercy. They scattered in a daze, each retreating to their separate wings to lick their wounds. Alara did not follow. She walked to the small, wood-paneled alcove that housed the mansion's intercom system, a device Eleanor had used countless times to summon her like a dog. She pressed the all rooms button. A soft tone echoed through the vast home. "Eleanor." "Liam." Chloe, her voice, calm and amplified, filled every corner of the house. "There will be a family meeting in the formal dining room in 10 minutes. Do not be late." The reversal of power was so profound, it was dizzying. 10 minutes later, they filed into the dining room, a place of so many of her past humiliations. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces like a dark mirror. Alara was already seated, not in her usual place halfway down the side, but in the large, throne-like armchair at the head of the table. Richard's chair. Her chair. She waited for them to take their seats before she began. Her voice was quiet, devoid of passion or revenge. She spoke like a CEO, outlining a corporate restructuring to a board she was about to fire. "We need to establish some new protocols for how this household will be run," she started, her eyes moving from one stunned face to the next. She looked first at Eleanor. "Eleanor, as of this morning, your access to the primary family accounts and trusts has been suspended. You will no longer have signatory power over any Vance holding. From now on, you will receive a monthly stipend to cover your personal expenses. The amount will be generous, but it will be finite, and it will be at my discretion. This house, as the will has made clear, is now legally mine. You are welcome to continue living here as my guest, on the condition that you respect my authority as the owner of this property." Next, she turned to a pale, trembling Chloe. "Chloe, the supplementary credit cards linked to the family trust will be deactivated at midnight tonight. I've reviewed your expenses for the past 5 years. Your lifestyle of complete leisure is over. Richard established a trust fund for you that you will inherit on your 30th birthday. Until then, I suggest you update your resume and begin looking for employment. Your unearned income has ceased." Finally, her gaze fell upon her husband. "And Liam, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I will be arriving at Vance Enterprises to assume my role as Chief Executive Officer. I will expect a full, detailed report from you and every department head on my desk by noon. For the time being, you will retain your current title, but your duties and authority will be under review. Your role, here and at the office, is now purely advisory. The word advisory was a dagger wrapped in corporate silk. It meant powerless. For a moment, there was only the sound of Chloe's ragged breathing. Then Eleanor slammed her hand on the table. "Absolutely not," she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. "I will not be put on an allowance in my own home by a gutter snipe. This house was built by my husband's grandfather. You have no right. You can't do this," Chloe wailed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to get a job. It's my money. Daddy wanted me to have it." Ilara let their hysteria wash over her, her expression unchanging. She waited for them to run out of breath. Then she folded her hands on the table. "You seem to be operating under a deep misunderstanding," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing them to lean in to hear. "This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." She gestured elegantly to the room around them. "This is my house. The accounts are my accounts. The company that pays for your clothes, your cars, and your comfort is my company. Richard, your husband and father, made that the undeniable, legal reality. He gave me the power, and I intend to use it. So, your choices are very simple. You can accept my terms and continue to live in this house, enjoying a life of considerable comfort, albeit under my authority, or you can leave." She pointed towards the hallway. "The front door, with its new lock, is right there. If you choose to walk through it, you will do so with only the assets held in your personal names. I've seen your financial statements. They are far less substantial than you imagine. So, you can have your pride, or you can have your comfort. You cannot have both. The choice is yours." She pushed back Richard's chair and stood up, the new queen of an empire built on their cruelty. "You have until dinner to decide." Without another glance at their horrified faces, she turned and walked out, leaving them imprisoned at the table of their own downfall, choked by the silence of their new, gilded cage. The first day of her reign was over. The new laws had been written. The first time Ilara walked through the towering glass doors of Vance Enterprises as its chief executive officer, a hush fell over the cavernous marble lobby. Heads turned, whispers followed her like a shadow. For years, she had only ever entered this building as a visitor, a quiet accessory on Liam's arm. Now, she walked alone, her heels clicking with a steady, resolute rhythm on the polished floor. She passed the oil portraits of Richard Vance, his father, and his grandfather, a stoic lineage of powerful men. The unspoken message was clear. She was an anomaly, an outsider who did not belong. The employees, from the security guards to the senior vice presidents, watched her with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and thinly veiled contempt. They saw a usurper. Ilara saw a company that needed to be saved from itself. Her first act was not to redecorate the corner office or give a rousing introductory speech. She convened an emergency meeting of all department heads in the main boardroom. Liam was there, his face a sullen mask, taking a seat at the far end of the table. Ilara took her place at the head, in the chair that had been Richard's. She waited for silence, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking the measure of each person. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm and clear, without a trace of nerves. "I am Ilara Vance, your new CEO. My tenure begins today, and it begins with a commitment to transparency and efficiency. To that end, my first executive order is the commissioning of a full, independent audit of all company operations, finances, and personnel, effective immediately." She looked directly at the CFO, one of Eleanor's oldest friends. "The firm of Deloitte has been retained. Their team will be arriving within the hour. I expect your full, unconditional cooperation." The word audit landed in the room like a grenade. A wave of panic, expertly concealed behind neutral expressions, rippled through the old guard. An audit meant that the secrets, the quiet understandings, the comfortable, corrupt ways of doing business under Liam and Eleanor's influence were about to be exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of day. The auditors descended like a silent, implacable army of accountants and lawyers. They were polite, professional, and missed nothing. For 2 weeks, a quiet terror gripped the executive floor. As servers were mirrored, expense reports from the last decade were scrutinized, and board meeting minutes were cross-referenced with project outcomes. Alara spent her nights in Richard's old study back at the estate, which was now her command center, poring over the preliminary findings. The rot, she discovered, was even deeper than she had imagined. The reports laid bare Liam's incompetence and deceit. He had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into a boutique design consulting firm. A quick search revealed the firm was a shell corporation registered to a single owner, Isabella Croft. The payments were for his mistress. The business trips to Paris, Milan, and Street Barts, all expensed to the company, had airline and hotel records for 2 passengers. He hadn't just been cheating on his wife, he had been stealing from his father's company to do it. The audit also exposed Eleanor's shadow influence. 2 of her friends sat on the board, drawing 7-figure salaries for attending 4 meetings a year. Their qualifications were non-existent. One had a degree in art history, the other was a socialite. They had rubber-stamped every one of Liam's disastrous and expensive vanity projects without a single question, their loyalty not to the company's health, but to their friendship with its matriarch. Armed with a mountain of irrefutable data, Alara scheduled a board meeting. She didn't make accusations. She simply presented the facts. The evidence of malfeasance was projected onto a large screen for all to see. She addressed each of Eleanor's cronies with surgical precision. "Mr. Albright," she said, her tone level, "the audit has flagged over $2 million in company funds paid to a catering company owned by your brother-in-law at a rate nearly 3 times the industry average. Can you explain this?" She turned to the other. "Miss Davies, can you explain your vote to approve the disastrous acquisition of Glowtech, given that the public records show you sold your personal shares in that company just 3 days before the announcement, avoiding a massive loss?" They stammered, they blustered, but they could not refute the cold, hard numbers. By the end of the meeting, their resignations were on the table. The next day, Alara promoted a brilliant, fiercely intelligent woman named Anya Chen to the position of Chief Financial Officer. Miss Chen had been with the company for 15 years, consistently overlooked for promotion because she was not part of the Vance's inner circle. Alara's message to the entire corporation was unequivocal. The age of cronyism was over. The age of merit had begun. Her revenge, however, was not confined to the boardroom. Its coldest, most exquisite form was enacted within the walls of the Vance estate. She had not thrown them out. That would have been a mercy. Instead, she made them stay and watch. They watched her leave every morning in a crisp power suit, stepping into the waiting company car that had once been theirs. They had to sit in the opulent drawing room and overhear her on conference calls, her voice confident and decisive as she undid the damage they had wrought. Chloe's reckoning came at the Chanel boutique on Fifth Avenue. Surrounded by fawning salespeople, she had attempted to purchase a $5,000 handbag, only to have the Black Vance family credit card declined. The public humiliation was absolute. She called Ilara, her voice a hysterical shriek of fury and disbelief. Ilara answered on her Bluetooth earpiece as she was reviewing quarterly projections. "The card is no longer active, Chloe," Ilara said calmly, as if explaining a simple math problem to a child. "We discussed this. That card was a company luxury, not a personal entitlement. If you desire a $5,000 handbag, you will need to get a job that allows you to afford one. It's a fascinating concept called earned income." She disconnected the call, leaving Chloe sputtering in the middle of the boutique. This was the nature of her justice. It was not loud or violent. It was the slow, methodical, and complete dismantling of their world, carried out with the detached precision of a bomb disposal expert. She was not just taking their power, she was forcing them to live in the quiet, agonizing reality of their own irrelevance, prisoners in a museum of a life they had once commanded. And every night, when she returned to the estate and sat in Richard's chair in the library, reviewing the work of the empire she was rebuilding, she knew this was a revenge far more profound than any screaming match could ever be. It was the revenge of competence over entitlement, of silence over noise, of justice over years of abuse. Power, once lost, leaves a phantom limb, an ache where authority used to be. For Liam Vance, the amputation of his power was a daily grinding agony. In the new world order of the Vance estate and its corresponding empire, he was a ghost haunting the halls of his own former life. He would attempt to give an order to the household staff, only to have them offer a polite, "I'll have to confirm that with Mrs. Vance." He drove to the office one morning to find his prime, reserved parking spot, the one marked L. Vance, had been reassigned to the new CFO, Anya Chen. He was now expected to park in the general executive garage. These were not grand defeats, but 1,000 tiny daily humiliations that chipped away at the crumbling edifice of his ego. Stripped of his direct power and financial freedom, he grew desperate. His only remaining asset, he believed, was his history with Alara. And so, he attempted to leverage the memory of a love he himself had killed. He began a campaign of pathetic, transparent tactics. The first was charm. He started appearing in her study late at night as she worked, holding a glass of her favorite wine. "I was just thinking about that trip we took to Tuscany," he would say, his voice a soft, nostalgic murmur. "Before everything got so complicated. We were happy then, weren't we?" Alara wouldn't even look up from her laptop. "That was a long time ago, Liam. I'm busy." When charm failed, he pivoted to pity and feigned remorse. He would find her in the garden, his shoulders slumped, his handsome face a mask of sorrow. "I know I failed you, Alara," he'd confess, his voice thick with counterfeit emotion. "I was weak. I let my mother's voice get in my head. The pressure of being a Vance. It makes you do things you regret. But I never stopped loving you. Not really." "Love is a choice, Liam," she replied once, her voice cutting through his performance like a shard of glass. "It is a daily action, and your actions consistently chose otherwise." Finally, when the soft approaches were rebuffed, a hint of his old arrogance would curdle into a threat. "You have to be careful, Alara," he warned, trying to sound concerned. "Shaking things up this fast at the company, making enemies. A woman in your position can be very vulnerable. You still need me. You need the Vance name to protect you." Alara listened to his clumsy manipulations, his pathetic attempts to regain a foothold, and felt nothing but a quiet, weary contempt. He was a chess player who had already been checkmated, but was still trying to move the pieces. She decided it was time to show him that the board had been cleared, and the game was, in fact, long over. She summoned him to the library that evening. "Liam," she said, her tone cool and professional, "we need to discuss the terms of our ongoing partnership. Be in my study at 9. He arrived promptly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He likely thought this was a negotiation, a chance to win back some of his lost ground. He found her sitting behind Richard's massive oak desk, the desk that was now unequivocally hers. The room was dimly lit, save for a single lamp that cast a pool of light on the polished wood, illuminating a single, thick manila folder that sat in front of her. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite the desk, the chair where supplicants and subordinates Saturday. He sat down, a nervous energy about him. "Alara, I'm glad we're finally talking. I think we can." She held up a hand, silencing him. Without a word, she slid the folder across the desk. It stopped directly in front of him. "Before we discuss the future," she said, her voice a low, chilling calm, "I think it's important that we have a clear and honest understanding of the past." Confused, Liam opened the folder. The first page was a high-resolution photograph of the text message from Isabella on his phone. His breath caught in his throat. He flipped the page. It was a copy of a credit card statement, a company card detailing the charges for a suite at the Carlisle Hotel, a $5,000 necklace from Cartier, and a dinner for two at Per Se. He had expensed it all as client entertainment. The next page was a copy of the flight itinerary for 2 to Street Barts. The page after that, the corporate registration documents for Isabella Croft's shell company, followed by the Vance Enterprises invoices and payment records for her fraudulent consulting fees. Page after page, a meticulous, damning chronicle of his betrayal, not just of his marriage, but of his fiduciary duty. The blood drained from his face. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a new, profound terror. The pathetic attempts at charm and pity were gone, replaced by the stark realization of a man who has just walked into a perfectly laid trap. Ilara leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. She did not yell. She did not cry. She spoke with the dispassionate clarity of a prosecutor reading a final indictment. I have known for 1 year, 7 months, and 12 days, Liam. I know about Isabella. I know about the money you stole from your father's company to fund your affair. I know that your mother encouraged it. I know that you were planning to leave me as soon as you had secured what you believed was your inheritance. She tapped the folder. What you saw as a love affair, I see as a classic case of corporate embezzlement, securities fraud, a profound breach of contract. You are not just an unfaithful husband, Liam. You are a criminal. He was speechless, his mouth opening and closing but no sound emerging. He was drowning, and she would not throw him a rope. So, here are the new terms of our partnership, she continued, her voice as hard as the diamonds on her finger. Our marriage, as a union of love and trust, is over. It is now a business arrangement, a performance for the public. You will be my devoted, supportive husband. You will stand by my side at galas. You will smile for the photographers at board events. You will applaud my speeches. You will project the image of a man who is proud and supportive of his brilliant, successful wife. You will be the perfect consort to the new queen. In exchange, she went on, you will be permitted to continue living in this house. You will receive a personal allowance, sufficient for a comfortable but not extravagant life. You will, in essence, be kept. However, you will have no power, no authority, and no say in this company or this family's finances. And you will never, ever contact Isabella Croft again. And if you refuse, she said, anticipating his next thought, if you deviate from this agreement in any way, this file, she tapped it again, will be duplicated. A copy will go to the board of directors, detailing your fraud. Another will go to the SEC. And a third, with a more personal narrative, will be leaked to the New York Times. You will not just be a social pariah, Liam. You will be prosecuted, and I will be the one to sign the complaint. The checkmate was absolute. His desperation finally curdled into pure, cold fear. He looked at the woman across the desk, his wife, the quiet girl he had married, the maid he had ignored, and for the first time, he saw the formidable, ruthless strategist she had become. He saw the depth of his miscalculation, the sheer totality of his defeat. He was not her partner, he was her prisoner. He slumped in his chair, every ounce of fight, arrogance, and hope draining out of him. He looked at the folder, then back at her, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the silent, unconditional surrender of a defeated man. Good, Ilara said, her voice crisp. She pulled the folder back to her side of the desk and closed it. The sound was a definitive, final click. I'm glad we've reached an agreement. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an empire to run. In the silent, opulent prison of the Vance estate, a toxic alliance was forged from the ashes of defeated pride. Eleanor and Chloe, stripped of their power and purpose, were bound together by a shared, festering hatred for Ilara. Their days, once a whirlwind of social engagements and lavish spending, were now long, empty corridors of time. They watched as Liam, a broken and compliant puppet, performed his role as the supportive husband, his spirit so thoroughly crushed that he barely met their eyes. They saw the news reports praising Ilara's bold restructuring of the company. They heard the staff, who now reported to Ilara, speak of her with a newfound respect. Every success she had was a fresh turn of the knife in their own failure. This bitter existence was intolerable. One afternoon, in a sun-drenched sitting room that now felt like a cage, Eleanor made a declaration. Her voice was a low, venomous whisper. This cannot stand. Direct confrontation is useless. Liam is a lost cause. But she is not invincible. She came from nothing, and people who come from nothing always have something to hide. Chloe, her face puffy from a morning of resentful tears, looked up with a flicker of hope. What can we do? We attack her foundation, Eleanor said, a cold fire rekindling in her eyes. Her past, we find a scandal, a secret, a lie. Something we can use to have her declared incompetent, unstable, unfit to lead this family or this company. We will hire someone to dig into every corner of her life. We will find her weakness, and we will break her with it. It was their final, desperate gambit. Pooling the last of their considerable but now finite personal funds, they hired a man named Marcus Thorne, a private investigator with a reputation for being discreet, thorough, and utterly devoid of morals. In a clandestine meeting at a quiet hotel bar in the city, they gave him his mission: find a crack in Alara's perfect facade. "We don't care what it is," Eleanor had instructed, her voice trembling with malice. "A secret love affair, academic cheating, a hidden debt, a family disgrace. Find it. We will pay you double if it's something we can use to destroy her." Thorne went to work. He delved into Alara's life with a forensic intensity. He traveled to her modest hometown, interviewing old high school teachers and neighbors. He scrutinized her university transcripts and financial aid records. He posed as a headhunter to speak with former colleagues from her old analyst firm. He dug, and he dug, and he found nothing. Alara's life was a fortress of integrity. She was brilliant, well-liked, and impeccably honest. Her family was unremarkable in the most respectable way. The woman was, to Thorne's professional frustration, utterly clean. But Thorne was a good investigator. And a good investigator follows every thread. Frustrated with Alara's past, he started digging into the Vance family's present, looking for a way to connect her to some hidden financial impropriety. And in doing so, he stumbled upon a different set of secrets. He was examining the network of Vance family charities when he noticed something odd about one in particular: the Richard Vance Foundation for Underprivileged Youth. On the surface, it was a noble cause, but Thorne noticed a pattern of enormous, regular administrative fee withdrawals being paid to a third-party holding company. This was a classic red flag. With a little more digging, he traced the holding company's registration. It had a single, anonymous owner. It took him 2 more days of illicitly pulling banking records to pierce the corporate veil. The owner of the holding company, the one who had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from a children's charity, was Eleanor Vance. Marcus Thorne was a mercenary, and the mercenary's first loyalty is to the person with the most power and the deepest pockets. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. He had the bombshell his clients had paid for, but it was aimed directly at them. To give this information to Eleanor would be professional suicide. She and her daughter were has-beens with dwindling funds. The real power, the future of the Vance fortune, now sat with Alara. He made a calculated business decision. The following week, Alara received a call from an unknown number. "Miss Vance," a man's voice said. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am a private risk consultant. I have come into possession of some sensitive information regarding a potential liability to the Vance corporate image. I believe it is in your best interest to meet with me." They met in a sterile, anonymous conference room Alara booked under a different name. Thorne, a weasel of a man in an expensive suit, laid out a folder on the table without a word of who had hired him. He simply presented his findings: the bank statements, the corporate filings, the undeniable trail of Eleanor's theft from her dead husband's legacy. He concluded his presentation by saying, "I believe in loyalty to the current leadership. I thought you should be the one to control this narrative." Alara reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable. She understood the entire, pathetic saga in an instant. This was the gun Eleanor had hired to shoot her, and it had backfired completely. She transferred a generous sum to Thorne's account for his discretion and loyalty and dismissed him. She now held the final weapon. That evening, she summoned Eleanor to the study. Her mother-in-law entered with a look of defiant anticipation, clearly assuming Thorne had delivered the ammunition she so desperately craved. "You wanted to see me?" Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. Alara didn't answer. She simply slid the investigator's folder across the desk. "I believe this is the report you were waiting for." Eleanor snatched it up, her eyes lighting up with vicious glee. She opened it. Alara watched as the color drained from her face, as the triumphant sneer dissolved into a slack-jawed horror. She saw her own name, her own secret bank accounts, her own betrayal laid bare in cold, black and white print. The report fell from her trembling fingers, its pages scattering across the expensive rug. "Your last gambit has failed, Eleanor," Alara said, her voice quiet but unforgiving. "In your attempt to find a flaw in my character, you only succeeded in exposing the rot in your own." She leaned back in her chair. "So now, you have a choice. The final choice you will ever make in this family. Option A, you will retire. Completely. You will resign from every charity board, effective tomorrow. You will cancel every luncheon, every gala, every social obligation for the rest of your life. You will live here, in this house, as a ghost. A silent, invisible recluse. Your comfort will be assured, but your public life, your precious status, will be over, forever. Or," Alara continued, her voice dropping, "Option B. I will hand this report, along with a detailed press release, to the district attorney and the New York Times simultaneously. You will face public humiliation on a scale you cannot even imagine, followed by criminal prosecution for fraud and embezzlement. Your name will be synonymous with disgrace." Eleanor stared at her, her eyes hollow, her face a ruin. The fight was gone. The fire was out. The great matriarch, the titan of society, had been utterly and completely broken, not by Alara's attack, but by the spectacular recoil of her own. "You have 1 minute to decide," Alara said. There was no need. The war was over. With a shuddering, ragged breath, Eleanor Vance, the woman who had tried to destroy her, gave a single broken nod of surrender. The war was over. The battles had been won, not with shouted declarations, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a corporate takeover. In the year that followed Eleanor's final, crushing defeat, a new kind of silence settled over the Vance estate. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the past, but the sterile, hollow silence of a perfectly preserved museum, a monument to a life that was no more. The Vance family, as the world had known it, was a dynasty in name only, its power held by the one person they had tried so desperately to exclude. Their fates were a quiet study in irony. Eleanor became a ghost in her own gilded cage. True to Alara's terms, she withdrew completely from the world, a recluse haunting the east wing of the mansion. Her name vanished from the society pages, her presence from the charity boards she once ruled. She lived a life of immense luxury and profound irrelevance, a punishment far more psychologically brutal than poverty could ever have been. Chloe, humbled by the harsh realities of a world without a limitless credit card, took a modest job as a junior assistant at an art gallery. The work was tedious, the pay was laughable by her former standards, and it forced upon her a humility that a lifetime of privilege had failed to instill. And Liam became a masterpiece of performance art. To the outside world, he was the perfect, supportive husband, always at Alara's side, his smile perfectly calibrated for the cameras. But in private, he was a hollow man, a handsome shell whose eyes held the vacant look of a king who had long forgotten what it was to rule. He was a prisoner, and the price of his comfortable cell was his soul. Alara, in contrast, had not just survived, she had thrived. She had taken the rotting, corrupted edifice of Vance Enterprises and with her sharp mind and relentless work ethic had rebuilt it from the foundation up. She had cut away the diseased parts, promoted a new generation of leadership based on merit, and steered the company towards a future that was more stable and more profitable than it had been in decades. She had earned the respect of her board, her employees, and even her rivals on Wall Street. She had won. But the true nature of her victory, the final, secret truth of her inheritance, was something she had yet to understand. The revelation came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Alara had decided it was time to truly make Richard's old study her own. While clearing out his immense antique desk, her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible seam in the wood, paneling at the back of a deep drawer. Curious, she pressed it. A hidden compartment, no bigger than a book, clicked open. Inside, there was a single, thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. On the front, in Richard's elegant, forceful handwriting, was her name, Ilara. With trembling hands, she broke the seal. The letter was dated just 1 week before his death. "My dear Ilara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means my faith in you was not misplaced. It means you have not only survived my family, but you have prevailed over them. I imagine you are now in command of my life's work, and you believe this was a reward for your suffering or a punishment for their cruelty. It was, I must confess, neither. I saw you from the very beginning. I saw your intelligence, your quiet strength, and the grace with which you endured the casual malice of my wife and the arrogant indifference of my son. I knew of Liam's affair. I knew of their conspiracy to break you, and my silence on these matters is a source of my deepest regret. But I was not just a silent witness to their moral failings. I was also the sole witness to their catastrophic professional incompetence. Ilara, I have not left you a prize. I have left you a sinking ship. In my final years, as my health began to fail, I ceded too much control to Liam. His vanity, his desperate need to prove himself, led him to make a series of disastrous, high-risk investments. My wife, in her ignorance, filled my board with sycophants who approved his every folly. They bled this company dry, covering their losses with clever accounting and mountains of debt. Vance Enterprises, the legacy my grandfather built, was on the brink of total collapse when I died. I did not give you this empire to punish them. I gave it to you because I believed you were the only person alive who could save it. Your mind, your discipline, your ability to see the skeleton beneath the skin, these were the qualities needed to navigate the coming storm. I burdened you with this, Ilara, not as a gift, but as a test and as my last, desperate hope to preserve my legacy. I am sorry for the weight of it, but I knew that you, unlike my own blood, were strong enough to bear it." Ilara finished the letter, the crisp paper shaking in her hand. A wave of profound, earth-shattering understanding washed over her. It was as if the last 10 years of her life had been suddenly recast in a new light. Her fight had not been a quest for revenge. It had been a battle for survival, not just her own, but for the livelihoods of the thousands of employees of Vance Enterprises. Her cold, calculated moves, the firings, the restructuring, the confrontation with Liam, these were not just acts of personal justice. They were the necessary, painful triage performed by a master surgeon saving a dying patient. She finally understood that her true victory was not in Eleanor's seclusion or Liam's subjugation. It was in the company's rising stock price. It was in the new, innovative projects she had greenlit. It was in the face of Anya Chen, her brilliant CFO, who was now leading a team with the authority she had long been denied. Richard hadn't given her a weapon to destroy his family. He had given her a broken kingdom, trusting that only she had the strength to rebuild it. 5 years after the reading of the will, when the stipulation of her leadership was fulfilled and the company was stronger than ever, Ilara quietly filed for divorce. It was a clean, efficient process. She gave Liam a respectable but modest settlement, enough to live comfortably but never to reclaim a fraction of his former power. It was not an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of finality. She no longer needed him as a prisoner to remind her of her victory. Her victory was all around her. She was free. The story ends not in the silent, haunted mansion, but in the glass-walled office at the top of the Vance Enterprises tower. Ilara stands, looking out at the sprawling city, a skyline of infinite possibility. She had walked into this family as a girl in love, been treated as a maid, and had emerged a queen. Not by birth, not by marriage, but by sheer force of will and intellect. She had transformed their cruelty into her strength, their secrets into her weapons, and their crumbling legacy into her triumph. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much, for when they finally choose to speak, their voice will not just be a sound, but a reckoning. And when they finally act, they will not just change their own life, but reshape the entire world around them. Join me next time as we uncover the secrets hidden behind the closed doors of another powerful family.